A single-engine plane touches down on a dirt strip deep in Mexico's Golden Triangle, carrying a cargo that will ignite a criminal empire. Before the world knew their names, Sinaloa's future kingpins inherited a region where corruption was law, and entire communities depended on the smuggling trade. But how did these remote valleys become the beating heart of a cartel that would challenge nations? The answer begins where landscapes meet ambition, and nothing is what it seems. In the late 1960s, as the sun set over the rugged mountains of the Sierra Madre, a new kind of traffic began to crisscross the skies above Sinaloa. Small, single-engine planes, battered by years of hard use, became lifelines for a trade that could not afford to wait for paved highways or official permission. Pilots, many with no formal training, learned to read the wind and the land by instinct. They landed on strips of bare earth carved out between cactus and scrub, guided only by memory and the glint of tin cans marking the boundaries. These makeshift runways, hidden deep in valleys or perched on plateaus, turned remote villages into launch pads for a new era of smuggling. Flight logs from the period when they exist at all tell stories of brief, harrowing journeys. A Cessna loaded with burlap-wrapped bricks of cannabis lifting off before dawn. A Piper Cub swooping low to avoid radar, hugging the contours of the hills. Each trip carried more than just drugs. It carried the hopes of entire communities that had little else to sell. The pilots themselves became legends, their names whispered with a mix of awe and envy. Some were sons of local farmers, others outcasts from cities to the north, all united by a willingness to risk everything for a payload that might change their fortunes overnight. They flew by the seat of their pants, dodging both weather and the occasional army patrol, trusting that a friendly official had been paid enough to look the other way. When a landing went wrong, the consequences were immediate and often fatal. Wrecked planes were sometimes left to rust where they fell, their cargoes quickly spirited away by waiting hands. The ingenuity of these early operators went beyond flying. Mechanics in Sinaloa's backcountry devised clever ways to squeeze more fuel into old tanks, patch bullet holes with scrap metal, and keep engines running on whatever parts they could scavenge. Radio operators, perched on hilltops with homemade antennas, relayed coded messages between pilots and ground crews. Even the timing of flights became a science, with departures scheduled to evade both Mexican authorities and U.S. border patrols. By the time the Guadalajara cartel began to consolidate power in the late 1970s, the air corridors of Sinaloa were already well established. These routes would become the backbone of a trafficking network that could move tons of product across borders in a matter of hours. The groundwork laid by these anonymous pilots and their support teams would shape the fortunes of the region for decades to come, setting a standard for logistical sophistication that later cartel leaders would inherit and refine. In those early days, the geography of Sinaloa was not a barrier, but an opportunity. Where others saw only isolation and hardship, these pioneers saw runways. Their daring and resourcefulness transformed the mountains and valleys into a dynamic network, a living map of risk and reward. The story of the Sinaloa Cartel begins not with violence or betrayal, but with the whine of a propeller and the red dust kicked up by a landing wheel, somewhere out beyond the reach of the law. Fields of poppy and marijuana once dotted the valleys of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua, an area known as the Golden Triangle. The land shaped the future of the drug trade. The soil was rich, the rainfall steady, and the mountains offered cover from the eyes of outsiders. By the 1970s, these valleys produced some of the highest yield opium and cannabis crops in all of Mexico, feeding a growing demand north of the border. Harvest time brought entire villages into the fields. Men, women, and children worked side by side, coaxing sap from poppy bulbs or cutting thick stands of marijuana. For many, there were few other options. The price of corn and beans had crashed, and government support was unreliable at best. But a kilo of opium paste or a bale of cannabis could fetch a small fortune, enough to build a house or send a child to school, if only for a while. Yet these crops did not move themselves. From the start, the business depended on a web of local power brokers. Mayors, police chiefs, and rural strongmen offered protection in exchange for a cut of the profits. Municipal offices became toll booths, collecting fees from growers and traffickers alike. Sometimes entire police forces were paid off to look the other way or to warn of an army raid. Those who refused to cooperate found their careers, and sometimes their lives, cut short. Corruption seeped into every level of rural government, blurring the line between criminal enterprise and public authority. The organization of the trade mirrored the rhythms of the land. Small farmers pooled their harvests and sold to middlemen who arranged transport out of the mountains. These brokers, often local notables or former officials, negotiated with buyers from larger trafficking groups. In some villages, the same family controlled the fields, the police post, and the local store. Loyalty was measured not just in cash, but in favors, jobs for relatives, loans for emergencies, gifts at weddings and funerals. This system of patronage bound communities together, even as it tied them to the fortunes of the drug trade. As the business grew, so did the need for coordination. The sheer volume of product moving through the Golden Triangle demanded careful management. Schedules had to be kept, routes secured, bribes paid on time. When a shipment was lost to a rival gang or a police bust, everyone in the chain felt the pain. Disputes could turn violent, but more often they were settled quietly through negotiation among local bosses. Over time, this patchwork of alliances and rivalries formed the backbone of a regional economy, one that operated in the shadows but touched every household. By the late 1970s, the Golden Triangle was no longer just a collection of isolated villages. It had become a living network, sustained by crops that were both illegal and indispensable. The money flowing in bought tractors, trucks, and satellite dishes. It also paid for bullets and bodyguards. The region's mayors and police chiefs grew wealthy, but so did the men who could organize harvests, move product across mountains, and keep the peace among competing interests. This communal infrastructure, rooted in land, labor, and loyalty, would nurture the traffickers who would soon rise to national power. The Sinaloa Cartel's future leaders learned early that survival depended not just on force, but on the ability to unite farmers, fixers, and officials into a single, self-sustaining system. Ismael El Mayo Zambada. Garcia built his reputation on patience and precision, not spectacle. While others chased headlines, he worked behind the scenes, weaving together a network that stretched from the valleys of Sinaloa to ports on the Pacific and highways reaching the U.S. border. His approach to leadership favored quiet alliances over open confrontation, and instead of ruling by fear alone, El Mayo relied on a web of mutual interests, carefully negotiated with local bosses, rival traffickers, and even authorities. These relationships formed a kind of invisible shield, helping the organization survive arrests, betrayals, and the constant threat of war. At the heart of El Mayo's strategy was discipline in communication. Trusted lieutenants used encrypted radios and coded language, reducing the risk of interception. Messages rarely traveled directly, and instead they moved through layers of intermediaries, each one loyal to the structure, but never privy to the full picture. This compartmentalization made it nearly impossible for outsiders, or even insiders, tempted to cooperate with law enforcement to unravel the whole network. When a shipment moved, every checkpoint along the route had been secured in advance, whether by payoffs, threats, or favors owed from years past. Supply chains under El Mayo's watch became models of efficiency. He coordinated the movement of drugs, money, and people with the attention of a logistics executive. Trucks, planes, and boats were scheduled to avoid overlaps and minimize exposure. If a route became too risky, he shifted operations without warning, leaving authorities searching empty warehouses or abandoned airstrips. Regional pacts were renewed and dissolved as needed, always with an eye toward stability. In some cases, he brokered truces between rival groups, preferring negotiation to bloodshed when business was at stake. El Mayo's ability to adapt kept the organization intact through decades of turmoil. When leaders fell, whether to bullets or handcuffs, his network absorbed the shock. New faces stepped in, but the system endured, guided by protocols he had set years before. Even as the U.S. intensified its war on drugs, the Sinaloa Cartel continued to thrive, its roots and alliances shifting like the riverbeds of the Sierra Madre after a storm. For Zambada, survival depended less on brute force than on the careful management of risk, loyalty, and information. His low profile was not weakness, but a deliberate choice, a way to keep the organization resilient, no matter who sat at the top. Joaquin Guzmán Loera, known to friends and enemies alike as El Chapo, never cared much for the shadows. Where others preferred to blend in, he thrived on risk and spectacle. In the early 1990s, while rivals clung to old smuggling routes and payoffs, Guzmán dreamed up new ways to move product under the noses of authorities. His signature move was the tunnel, a feat of engineering that turned the border itself into a line to be erased. The first prototypes appeared beneath the streets of Agua Prieta and Otay Mesa, stretching hundreds of feet from warehouses in Mexico to safe houses in the United States. Workers dug by hand, sometimes for months, reinforcing walls with scavenged wood and steel. Electric lights, ventilation fans, and even rail tracks turned these passages from muddy holes into operational pipelines. Shipments that once took days now crossed in hours, bypassing checkpoints and patrols. U.S. agents would discover a tunnel, only to find another opening up a few blocks away. Each discovery made headlines, but for every tunnel found, several more slipped beneath the radar. Guzmán's willingness to gamble extended beyond the tunnels. He was known for moving convoys at high speed across the desert, timing shipments to coincide with police shift changes, and bribing officials at every level. But risk has a cost. In June 1993, after a bloody shootout at the Guadalajara airport that left Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo dead, Guzmán found himself the most wanted man in Mexico. He fled across the border into Guatemala, hoping to disappear among the chaos. Instead, Guatemalan police caught him just days later, handing him over to Mexican authorities. His arrest set off a scramble within the Sinaloa Cartel. Allies moved to secure his routes and pay off judges, while rivals circled like vultures. Inside prison, Guzmán continued to pull strings. Bribes flowed freely, and messages traveled in and out, keeping him at the center of decision-making. The impact of his capture rippled through the organization. Some saw it as a sign that the era of untouchable bosses was ending. Others took it as proof that only those willing to push boundaries literally and figuratively could survive. Even behind bars, Guzmán's legend grew. Stories spread of guards on his payroll, of feasts smuggled into his cell, of escape plans whispered late at night. The tunnels he pioneered became both a symbol and a tool, a way to outmaneuver the state, and a promise that no wall, no matter how high or thick, could hold him forever. His arrest in 1993 did not end his influence. It only forced him to innovate further, setting the stage for the dramatic escapes and power struggles that would define the cartel's next chapter. No single blueprint defined how the Sinaloa Cartel made its decisions or weathered storms. Instead, it was the unlikely partnership between Ismael "El Mayo" Zambada and Joaquin "El Chapo" Guzmán Loera that created a living system, one able to bend without breaking. Their styles could not have been more different. El Mayo moved quietly, valuing trust and patience, rarely exposing himself to risk or the limelight. El Chapo, by contrast, thrived on bold moves and public displays, turning even his escapes into legends. Yet, when it came to the cartel's survival, their approaches fit together like gears in a well-oiled machine. When a crisis struck, whether a rival made a grab for territory or a key lieutenant was arrested, the two men favored consensus over chaos. Major decisions were rarely made alone. Trusted lieutenants would gather, sometimes in remote ranches, sometimes in safe houses shielded by layers of security. Discussions could stretch for hours, with each voice weighing risks and rewards. In these councils, profit was not just divided, it was protected. Routes were assigned, bribe money allocated, and disputes settled before they could spill into open conflict. If a shipment was lost, the loss was absorbed by the group, not just the individual. This profit-sharing system discouraged betrayal and made it safer to take risks, knowing the consequences would be shared. Secrecy and spectacle coexisted in careful balance. El Mayo insisted on compartmentalizing information so that few knew more than they needed. Shipments moved along routes mapped out months in advance, with each checkpoint controlled by someone loyal to the cartel but blind to the bigger picture. Yet, when a show of force was needed, when a rival threatened a plaza or the government closed in, El Chapo was willing to go public, sending convoys of gunmen or orchestrating prison breaks that captured headlines worldwide. This duality kept authorities guessing. Was the cartel preparing for war or quietly shifting its assets to safer ground? Adaptability became the cartel's greatest asset. When U.S. pressure intensified, or a Mexican general announced a new crackdown, the leadership would pivot. Smuggling routes changed overnight. Money moved through new channels. Sometimes entire operations were paused, with workers sent home and safe houses emptied, only to restart weeks later under a different guise. The decision-making process was never written down, but it was understood by those who mattered. Loyalty was rewarded, mistakes were quietly corrected, and new leaders were groomed from within, ensuring the organization could survive even the loss of its most famous faces. The human factor, trust, fear, ambition, was always present. El Mayo and El Chapo did not need to like each other to work together. They needed only to recognize that their futures depended on a system that could outlast any one man. In the end, it was this blend of discipline and daring, secrecy and spectacle that allowed the Sinaloa Cartel to become more than the sum of its parts. In February 2009, law enforcement agencies across the United States launched a sweeping operation that would bring the Sinaloa Cartel's reach into sharp relief. Operation Accelerator unfolded over 21 months, culminating in a series of coordinated raids that spanned California, Minnesota, Maryland, and beyond. At dawn, agents from the DEA, FBI, and local police moved in, targeting stash houses, distribution hubs, and suspected cartel operatives. By the end of the operation, 755 suspects were in custody, each one tied to a network that funneled methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and marijuana across the border and into American cities. The numbers told their own story. Authorities seized more than $59 million in cash, an arsenal of nearly 150 weapons, and over 12 tons of drugs. Properties, vehicles, and bank accounts linked to cartel money laundering were frozen or confiscated. The Department of Justice called it one of the largest crackdowns ever mounted against a Mexican trafficking group operating on United States soil. Operation Accelerator was more than just a show of force. It reflected years of surveillance, wiretaps, and undercover work. Agents tracked shipments from rural Sinaloa to the streets of Los Angeles and Baltimore, following trails of coded messages and shell corporations. The arrests hit every level of the organization, from local street dealers to high-ranking coordinators. Yet even as the headlines celebrated the operation's scale, questions lingered about the cartel's ability to adapt. The Sinaloa network had weathered storms before, rebuilding after arrests and shifting routes when pressure mounted. For a moment, the machinery of the cartel ground to a halt. But the story of its resilience was far from over. In the summer of 2017, the eyes of the world turned to a Brooklyn federal courtroom. Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán, once the most elusive figure in the drug trade, now sat at the defense table, flanked by attorneys and marshals. Prosecutors laid out a mountain of evidence: intercepted calls, ledgers, photographs of seized shipments, and the testimony of former cartel insiders. The trial became a spectacle. It laid bare the inner workings of the Sinaloa Cartel for a global audience. The prosecution's case drew from years of surveillance and cooperation agreements. Witnesses described coded conversations, hidden airstrips, and suitcases of cash exchanged in hotel rooms from Mexico City to Chicago. Courtroom exhibits included photos of elaborate tunnels, satellite images of clandestine crossings, and stacks of ledgers tracking millions in profits. One after another, former associates testified about bribes paid to police and politicians, the logistics of moving tons of cocaine and heroin, and the chain of command that stretched from mountain villages to American suburbs. The proceedings revealed not just the scale of the operation, but the vulnerability at its core. With Guzmán on trial, the myth of the untouchable kingpin began to unravel. For the first time, jurors and millions following the case in the press heard the details of betrayals, escapes, and the constant threat of violence that shaped every decision. The U.S. legal system, with its public records and relentless cross-examination, stripped away layers of secrecy that had protected the cartel for decades. But the spectacle in Brooklyn was more than a personal reckoning. As the verdict neared, cartel leaders in Mexico, watched closely. The removal of such a high-profile figure sent shockwaves through the organization, creating a leadership vacuum that would force the cartel to rethink how it operated. The trial's impact reached far beyond the courtroom, setting the stage for a new era of adaptation and a shift in the very business model that had made Sinaloa so powerful. In the decade of 2010 to 2019, the Sinaloa Cartel faced a crossroads. Traditional crops like marijuana and opium poppy, once the lifeblood of the Golden Triangle, no longer guaranteed steady profits. U.S. legalization efforts and synthetic substitutes undercut prices, pushing traffickers to rethink their business. The answer came in the form of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid many times more potent than heroin and far easier to produce in hidden labs than to grow in open fields. Small shipments could yield enormous returns, and the risk of detection was lower than ever before. To meet demand, the cartel built a network of clandestine laboratories scattered across Sinaloa and neighboring states. Chemists sourced precursors from suppliers in China and India, moving shipments through ports like Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas. The labs worked around the clock, churning out pills and powder destined for U.S. cities reeling from the opioid crisis. Unlike the sprawling plantations of the past, these operations could be concealed in a warehouse or a rented house, making them harder for authorities to find and shut down. Clandestine operations moved fast, profits soared, but so did the need to hide the money. The cartel's financial wing evolved just as quickly as its drug labs. Bulk cash shipments across the border gave way to sophisticated laundering tactics. Shell companies, fake invoices, and trade-based schemes moved millions through seemingly legitimate businesses, importing seafood, electronics, even auto parts. Money flowed through banks in Mexico, the U.S., and beyond, often cycling through several countries before surfacing as clean capital. The old method of stashing cash in safe houses was replaced by a system that could wash billions without leaving a trail. This shift to synthetics and financial innovation insulated the cartel from many of the shocks that crippled rivals. Arrests and raids might take down a lab or freeze a bank account, but the network adapted, rerouting chemicals and funds with a few phone calls. The model proved resilient, fueling the rise of new factions and setting the stage for bitter fights over control of these lucrative streams. As fentanyl deaths climbed in the United States, the Sinaloa cartel's grip on the trade only tightened, proving that adaptability, not firepower, was the real engine of survival. Lines hardened inside the Sinaloa cartel as profits from fentanyl and synthetic drugs soared. The organization, once held together by the steady hands of Mayo Zambada Garcia and the daring of Chapo Guzmán, fractured along lines of loyalty and ambition. Two camps took shape, each with its own vision for the future and its own claim to the spoils. On one side stood the Maíza, loyalists to El Mayo, led by trusted lieutenants like Ismael Zambada Siqueiros, known as El Mayito Flaco. Their approach favored stability, careful alliances, and a steady flow of revenue, even if it meant sharing territory or profits with old partners. On the other stood the Chapiza, led by El Chapo's sons, Ivan Archivaldo, Jesus Alfredo, Ovidio, and Joaquin Guzmán Lopez. For them, the new era was about expansion and speed, pushing deeper into the fentanyl trade and fighting for control of the most lucrative export routes. Tensions simmered over who would control key plazas, border crossings, ports, and corridors that funneled billions north each year. Disputes over revenue split, and strategy became personal. The 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝘀 accused the old guard of clinging to outdated methods and leaving money on the table. The Mayo countered that reckless moves risked drawing too much attention from authorities and rivals alike. Meetings once meant for coordination turned into battlegrounds of accusation and suspicion. Allies were forced to choose sides, and every shipment became a test of loyalty. The cartel's unity, once its greatest strength, now hung by a thread, as leaders weighed the cost of compromise against the risk of open war. In this climate, every decision carried consequences, not just for those at the top, but for the entire network that depended on their judgment. October 17th, 2019. Afternoon heat pressed down on Culiacán as gunfire erupted across the city. Convoys of armed men roared through the streets in pickup trucks, faces masked, rifles bristling out windows. They set up roadblocks at major intersections, torched vehicles, and unleashed a barrage that echoed from the city center to the outskirts. In neighborhoods, families huddled behind locked doors while bursts of automatic fire rattled windows. By nightfall, the city was paralyzed. Schools, businesses, and even hospitals were shuttered as chaos spread. Reports flooded in of cartel gunmen storming prisons, freeing dozens of inmates, and threatening to execute hostages if their demands were not met. The target of their fury was the sudden arrest of Ovidio Guzmán López, one of El Chapo's sons and a key figure in the 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗀 faction. Instead of retreating, the Chapitos launched a full-scale siege. They coordinated attacks on military convoys, ambushed police officers, and surrounded the homes of soldiers' families. The city's main avenues became battlefields, with at least 14 people killed and dozens more wounded in the crossfire. As the hours dragged on, Mexican security forces found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. Calls for reinforcements went unanswered as cartel firepower overwhelmed even armored vehicles. By evening, the government made a decision rarely seen in modern history. They ordered a withdrawal. Ovidio was released, and the military retreated. The message was clear. On that day, the power of the Sinaloa Cartel was laid bare for the world to see. The state had blinked first, and the streets of Culiacán belonged to the 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗀𝗃. On July 25, 2024, a private jet touched down at a small airfield in El Paso, Texas. Inside sat Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia, long considered the last of the old guard cartel bosses, and Joaquin Guzmán López, son of El Chapo. The landing was not routine. U.S. federal agents swept the tarmac, moving in before the engines cooled. Zambada, 76 years old and wanted for decades, had been lured across the border under the pretense of inspecting smuggling routes. Instead, he found himself in handcuffs, caught in a ruse orchestrated by Guzmán López, who had quietly negotiated his own surrender with U.S. authorities. This was an arrest that sent shockwaves through the underworld. Within hours, the Department of Justice announced the arrests, calling it a decisive blow against the Sinaloa Cartel's leadership. News spread quickly across both sides of the border. In Sinaloa, the effect was immediate and violent. Homicide reports from Culiacán and neighboring towns surged in the following weeks. Local morgues filled as gunmen loyal to rival factions. Mayo and 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗀𝗀𝗃 settled scores and scrambled for control. Roadblocks sprang up overnight. Families fled rural enclaves, seeking safety as gunfire echoed through the valleys. Security analysts warned that removing a figure like El Mayo would not bring peace. Instead, they pointed to a pattern seen before, where every so-called decapitation unleashes new waves of bloodshed as younger lieutenants and rival bosses rush to fill the power vacuum. In the chaos, the old rules, negotiated truces, and careful alliances gave way to open warfare. The legacy of El Mayo, once defined by patience and quiet order, now hung in the balance as the organization he built fractured under the weight of its own ambition. The cartel's future, once steered from the shadows, spun into uncertainty, leaving Sinaloa at its most unstable point in a generation. As the Sinaloa Cartel adapts to every crackdown, its influence stretches from rural Mexico to cities across the globe. Today, cartel-produced fentanyl floods the streets of the United States, fueling record overdose deaths, over 70,000 in 2022 alone. Law enforcement pressure shifts tactics, but the cartel's reach endures. In this ongoing war, every policy, every border, every decision still echoes with the consequences. The story is not finished. It is unfolding around us. Join the conversation below